Hello, Internet. It is time for not quite a Wednesday serial, but I wanted to take a shot at answering a question that Mr. CD Camp asked. And I want to try to spit poetic for a second. So, what he asks is there a superhero genre? Yes. Okay. But let's break down why, because that's where we get interesting. And the truth is yes, but no. The truth is definitively, without a question of a doubt that should be in anyone's mind, there is a superhero sub-genre. Beyond any shadow of a doubt in my mind, there's a superhero sub-genre. Yes. Is it its own genre? That depends where you want to break down the lines. And when you start looking at lists of genre, you start talking about different genres. Unless you're going to keep it at a very high-minded, there is drama, there is comedy, and there is mystery, and there is poetics, basically, and arguably a couple others. And that's the thing, is depending on who you talk to, you're going to get a different thing every time. Even at high-minded literary discussions, and that's a lot of what they do, is write papers back and forth debating this kind of thing. I don't know. So whether you want to label it as a genre or a subgenre, yes, it exists. But, okay, so what is a genre, right? Well, a genre is really the only real useful definition. Again, what is genre is going to be broken out, but roughly and usefully, it is a certain category that you can submit a certain type and number of works to create a category separate from everything else. There's something shared in that, and there's going to be things on the fringe of it, and there are going to be things that are almost defined by being the antithesis of what defines it normally, and then being wrapped in because it is clearly 100% informed by the genre, yet it is its antithesis. And with superheroes, I mean, very easily you could say something like Punisher, Ghost Rider, or in a weird way like The Authority, or something to that end. But is there a genre? Subgenre? Yes. Another useful way to define genre, again, as a selection of stories that fit a certain element separate from a different genre, and again, these can bleed, there can be gray area, there's the antithesis, all of that. But what really defines a genre is a certain collection of tropes that they all share. What is a trope? You're going to get a different definition no matter who you talk to. But a trope comes down to being an idea or an element within a story that is used, repeated enough to be identified on its own amongst those different works. When you look up the definition, they say it's synonymous with cliché. I argue that based on my education, because a cliché is really a poorly used trope. Now, part of what makes a trope poorly used is overuse, certainly. But I mean, just because it's identifiable and you can tie that thread amongst different works, doesn't necessarily mean it's poorly or overused at that point, or even an overused trope can be spun or used in a way that is refreshing. I'm sure in some literary class, they showed you a cliche, and then they showed you a spin on it, and suddenly that was interesting. But it's interesting in that context only now, because otherwise it's just overused. There's a million examples. It's often the difference between, like, a superhero flying out the window and you being like, I've seen this before, or a superhero falling out the window and you going, that was a cool scene. And it's really, I mean, it can come down to preference, it can come down to a lot, but usually there's a useful writerly way to look at that scene and at least tell whether they're attempting to make it a use of the trope versus just using the cliche. And it, again, gray area, all of this is open to interpretation, but at least setting the general rules is not as much so. But again, literary discussion will make it all a gray area, and that's what some people get paid to do. And here's to them helping society. So just for example, something more recent that I've seen kind of become a trope slash cliche, because there's a TV show that I think that put it one too far, was the idea of the villain getting caught and being put into prison as part of their plan. There might be a better name for that. But it was done in the Batman movie with the Joker, and he was all ha ha ha. But I mean, there's also 2 TV shows running concurrently, unless one of them got canceled. I didn't hear about it yet. That use that very idea as the premise of their show. And so there you go. There's 3. I mean, patterns usually need to at least hit a 3, right? That's a mathematical rule, not a literary one. And so you hit kind of a trope status there, assuming that they're elevated enough works that they reach a certain amount of public consciousness. It gets into a whole nother realm of where you want to talk about. But it's interesting because with comics, where you hit that line is a much more of a gray area than other mediums, which doesn't sound relevant necessarily, but when you start talking about independent works, and you're talking about people in a certain area, some local comics actually have a certain amount of resonance. Certain circles on the web are going to have webcomics with a certain amount of resonance, and they're going to reference and talk about it. Like, you're going to talk about humor in comics and stuff, and you can't talk VG Cats or Penny Arcade or Mega Tokyo or something, you're not going to understand kind of the tropes and uses that those comics share that other comics don't. And so you're kind of missing an element to it. And I bring up those comics because I happen to know that's very something that a lot of my personal friends talk about a lot, but here in the community, not so much. Just to kind of remind people that sometimes tropes are out there and you could be wholly ignorant about it, even though it's right next to the realm that you consider yourself knowledgeable about. And I'm sure wholeheartedly there are things like that I'm completely ignorant of, but I can't list them as examples because I'm ignorant of them. So, nah. So what is it that makes a superhero genre? What are some of the major tropes? There's actually a Wikipedia article on this, so I want to delve to that. Just for the record, on Wikipedia it is listed as superhero fiction, which makes sense. But there is also technically accounts of superhero nonfiction, so you'd have to literally divide that, and there would be different tropes and technically be a different genre, but again, the bleeding and the gray area. So, and obviously one is very informed by the other. But here are the elements, at least at a very top level, that are listed. And this makes sense. So what are elements that are needed for superhero fiction? One is superheroes. And actually in your video, Mr. CDC, I saw some people comment, and they were talking about the fact that, what is a superhero, you know? And I mean, generally, yeah, it's someone imbued with superhuman abilities. But I've actually kind of landed at a different angle, because I feel like there's plenty of superheroes that, I mean, yes, are kind of imbued with superpowers, certainly, but there's some just as well not. The Guardian, I mean, you could argue, like, I mean, Doc Savage isn't exactly a normal human either, but, like, the Question doesn't really have superpowers. A lot more of the detective types don't have superpowers, but they are just as much part of the whole deal. Plus, there's certain characters, like your, I don't know, Casey Jones, or your Guardian, basically. I guess he got a serum. But I mean, even the Punisher, is part of this, but no superpowers per se, though not necessarily believable characters, depending on the story and who writes them, yada yada. But, okay. So superhero is usually someone who I feel takes it upon themselves to go fight crime as their calling, but not as necessarily a profession more, and does so in a colorful way, which isn't really a good definition at all. But I feel like we forget that the idea of hero, in a literary sense, is just necessarily not just a protagonist, but more classically how we understand protagonist is a hero. Someone who is going to lead us through the adventure, who's going to do what's right, and they are going to save the day. Yet, normally the hero is informed by something for country or for personal gain, not necessarily selfish personal gain, but growing as a person, or to, say, avenge their family, a la something Shakespeare or something. Point being, superheroes, generally in a very superhero-y book, sans, ironically, the movies, which is where I feel like the idea of superhero fiction as a title really started to take off in popular consciousness more lately. They do it just to go help people, whereas most superhero movies, especially the Batman ones, the Nolan Batman ones, the hero is just... Batman, in that case, is just taking care of their own personal vendetta. He's not Batmaning to save Gotham. He's Batmaning to avenge his own personal desires, something for his parents, something around his companies, something about his honor. But it all ties back to him. It actually makes him, in my mind, not a superhero. It just makes him hero Batman lesser, in that sort of a respect. And there's plenty of other superhero movies more like that, because it has to be so personally tied to them in that case that they're not really superheroes anymore. They're just caught up in their own weird thing. And this applies as much to comics too. Like a lot of the Jeff Johns Green Lantern stuff, it's like a lot of the people like have their own personal story that get them inducted into whichever corps that they go to, and then they're basically in an intergalactic fight club amongst themselves, and no problems really spill out or deal with anyone else. Kind of examples and stuff off to the side that make that not necessarily 100% truth, obviously, and within the entirety of Jeff Johns' Green Lantern run, but for the most part, yeah, it's a little too inclusive to be useful to anyone outside of their weird little Rainbow Fight Club. I went on a tangent. Anyways, superheroes generally have costumes, powers, or something that sets them apart from mere mortal people. There are super villains, and that's a good point. It's not just someone imbued with an ability and then they fight Joe Schmo. They're fighting, cosmic clashes. We're getting this big, almost, in a way, informative by old mythology kind of duels and fights amongst people. Supervillains are actually really suspect and held to a lot of what informs the superhero. Their power sets need to be matched in some way. Their costume almost has to play off of each other in some way sometimes. And something about this supervillain needs to challenge or question something about the hero themselves almost to be more useful. There's a reason why a lot of Spider-Man's villains are very zoo-centric, animal-based. There's a reason why a lot of Captain America's foes have a certain political Cold War, just post-World War II era bend to them. There's a reason why a lot of Iron Man's enemies either are technologically based or are completely to the antithesis of technology and that sort of progression. It's just, there's something about that. And of course there's issues where not at all, but for the rogues gallery kind of thing. There's a reason why a lot of Batman's villains are different manifestations of mental health issues. Goes on. Another big part of superheroes is secret identities. Of course, you can name superheroes that don't deal with secret identities, but it's usually there's a reason why they don't have a secret identity, or in truth, they adopted their new persona. Like the Punisher, Frank Castle, everybody knows Frank Castle is the Punisher, but he's the Punisher. He's not really Frank Castle anymore. He's the Punisher. He's adopted this new role. Interestingly, they list death. The way that it's handled in comics is kind of an element, which is interesting that death is so trivial to a lot of these characters. That's actually, to however this article was penned on Wikipedia, an element which I think is interesting. I would question it in some different ways, but I think it's also completely valid. Then this is interesting. The idea of continuity with superheroes, they say, is part of the genre. I think that's not true. Continuity, in the way it's done, especially with Marvel and DC superheroes, also, Image superheroes, yeah, it's tied to the idea of superheroes in a lot of ways, but it's not necessarily needed to make a superhero genre story. A lot of them are self-contained. You could write something like The Cape or the Rocketeer movie that does, which is superhero genre but not comics, and for that it doesn't necessarily need to be continuity, but it's generally tied to the idea, and the idea that if there's one superhero there would have to be more than one seems to be a prevailing logic of it all. And yes, like I said, if there's not, it's usually an antithesis almost idea kind of thing, but not necessarily. I feel like that's a form and function of the medium that superheroes has been tied to for a while, which plays more to... And honestly, that's more than just comics. That's going back to the old TV shows and radio plays and all that. It's always been serialized stuff, and I feel like that's more an element of serialized, but there's no reason that you can't write a novel or tell a one-off story or make a movie, and these things can be self-contained. And that's been done before plenty of times. It's just more often than not, it's more forgettable than your Spider-Mans or Batmans and all that, which tie into whatever. Because Marvel and DC own the concept of superheroes in so many ways in an American mindset. And off that, crossovers is part of it, but I don't understand why they distinguish between continuity and crossovers. I read it, but it's a weird... That's just typographical. So yeah. But that was only one question you asked, you devious son of a bitch. The next thing you asked was kind of open-ended, so I'm going to kind of reel it in for my purposes. You were asking about different kinds of books that we read, comic books, so I'm going to stay there for now. And whether or not those fit in the idea of a superhero genre. Now that I've kind of laid it out, I feel like that's an easier question to answer, maybe, because it's like, well, does it meet or antithesized by certain sets of criteria? And so, but I'm going to break it down in some interesting ways, hopefully, to make you question everything I just said. So how about I just invalidate? Yeah, that's useful, because that's how literary theories question, pushed, and useful, and that's what makes this an interesting discussion. So you kind of put on, like, the idea of the superhero is elevated by Superman. Yes, and Superman was informed by certain characters before it, but to say that, like, in so many ways, Superman is the idea and kind of the origin point of the superhero, 100% yes. Superman is the first and the definitive superhero. I don't give a fuck what anyone says about Doc Savage. That was proto stuff that really is belonging to pulp and a different area and a different time and a different thing. Doc Savage is not really a superhero unless he's reinterpreted by Superman. I know that's going to sound weird to some people who've really read all that, because it is a weird fine line, but there is, frankly, a big difference between the two, and Superman really, really is kind of the first superhero. Not necessarily as of his first appearance, but as he kind of classically came to be known. Yes, Superman, superhero, all the way. Then, of course, you have the very antithesis of him, yet he very much fits it. Batman, yes, superhero. Does he have superpowers? Yeah, he kind of does. I know some people are going to be like, no, that's the whole point of Batman. Read a fucking Batman comic. Humans are not capable of that amount of fucking bullshit, especially by being in their mid-20s. It's not possible. You can't be the ultimate Renaissance man at anyways, yeah, different rant, different time. What I'm going to posit, though, as an interesting line between what is a superhero and not, is one of my favorite comics. Now, I think some people might be thinking Deadpool, and Deadpool is a superhero comic, especially when you're talking about the Joe Kelly stuff where they make hero a dirty word. He lives in a superhero universe. He's defined by it. He doesn't necessarily want to be a superhero. He's forced into it by the end of the story. That is a superhero story that rides on a weird edge and takes advantage of those characters and all the tropes to make an interesting story and kind of play with all that, but it's completely informed by superhero understanding. No, the one I want to posit is the Ninja Turtles. Now, when you talk the original Kevin Eastman, Peter Laird Ninja Turtles, are they superheroes? No. They're science fiction characters, basically. They are mutants that learn ninjutsu, then they commit revenge, and that's the first shot. They are not superheroes in that book by any means. They go and they murder a man in thermite grenade, cold blood anyways, metaphorically, and they kill a man. And there's nothing really heroic about it. I mean, they're avenging their master's master, whatever. But superheroes, that doesn't really ring. I mean, they're not wearing costumes. They don't have really... I mean, you can argue the Shredder's in a weird getup, but it's technically ceremonial. I know, you can argue that any way you want, but they go and they kill a man. And I think that's another big part of superhero is there has to be a certain morality to it. For the most part, superheroes don't kill. Now, the Punisher is informed by that because he lives in that world, and he kills, and he's kind of outcast for it. Despite the fact that cold justice makes a lot of sense, especially for the people he kills, yada yada yada. Here, the Turtles don't necessarily need to kill him. Like, imprisoning him would probably be worse, but no, they don't. You get to the second issue, and then they start helping someone who becomes their friend, but irregardless, then they do something to help the city, and then they start becoming more heroic, but they're almost a little bit different by then. And then it goes in weird places, and then they're tied in their own like blood feud stuff, and so they don't seem very super heroic. When you're talking about Turtles on the cartoon side, which is more to keep it comic book level, the Archie printing books, they are 100% superheroes. They live in the sewers. I mean, yeah, they aren't necessarily in costumes, but they have to shroud their identity. It's not exactly a secret identity, but it's a twist on that. They don't kill anything or anyone, really, and they're eco-warriors, not eco-terrorists, because they're the good guys, and, you know, whatever. So kind of depending on the reading and the when, where, why, who's printing, who's writing of the Ninja Turtles, they're either not really superheroes or they are. They kind of ride a line there. But you did ask about different things. I kind of already wrapped in the Punisher and Deadpool kind of anti-heroes. And yes, they are in the superhero genre, even if they are not necessarily exclusively superheroes themselves. Their books and their stories are part of it because those characters are so tied to those things. Now, if you're to take a Punisher book and when you really pull it honestly outside of the Marvel universe, might still be published by Marvel, but it's just the Punisher dealing with a crime syndicate. Those honestly sometimes do just feel like crime stories, and I'm totally willing to accept that that character rides out into that area. Much like in the way that sometimes, honestly, Batman rides back into detective mode, and it becomes a mystery story more than a superhero story. But usually with Batman, that's not the case, but something more like The Question, that's actually fairly likely. But, let's ride the line a little harder. What about something like Hellblazer? I'd argue that's superhero, but that's more on the mysticism side, obviously. But it keeps a certain tangent. It forces a certain level of suspension of disbelief. And so, because it's so kind of out there and he's dealing with, honestly, kind of like super villainous, hyper level stuff, it feels superhero-y, even though he's a bastard, you know. It's just, that is kind of the level. CDC Camp brought up the idea, is The Walking Dead superhero genre? I'm wondering if someone wants to make an argument about the character, but considering that the entire theme point of it is like, you know, the horrible level of humanity after an apocalypse hits, it's just, no. It's horror. It's pretty straight up a horror book. Yeah. I don't think there's a lot of ins or outs about that one. Now, what's interesting about that is that, unfortunately, comic books and the superhero genre have been intrinsically tied in a lot of people's minds, and that they feel like because it's a comic, it has to be superhero, and that is just bullshit. Superheroes can exist in comics, they can exist outside of comics, they don't have to fucking exist at all, but they do, and I hope they keep doing because I really enjoy it. But, regardless, it is a genre on its own right. Genre is not medium. I've said that before on this channel, and I will have to say it again, because literary education isn't what it should be in this or any country, probably. So, I've talked about genre and tropes within this video, so I don't feel I have to go over that. But medium, what is medium? Medium is what it is. There's not a lot of debate on medium. When you're reading a comic book, they are pages, whether they be digital or print, that you flip through and have frames and whatnot. And I'm not going to get into a Scott McCloud what is a comic debate here, because that's ridiculous. Also, Scott McCloud's definition of what a comic is bullshit. No, but I mean, you know when you're reading a comic versus when you're reading a book. Now, whether it is a book of poetry or prose, it does not actually matter to the medium, because how you use the words does not affect the medium. If it's just printing words, it is that. Now, of course, there is a gray area, and that gray area is generally something called a zine, where people just publish stuff, or there's like, poetry handouts where there's usually some art in there, and usually they try to play it so that the poem and the image have some sort of interplay to like get a more of a thought or more of an idea out of it. Those are not comics. That is poetry with an image next to it. That is a zine. That is a publication. Like a magazine, and a magazine technically is a different medium, but I mean, you guys get that idea. Also, TV is a medium. The internet is a really weird thing to call a medium because you can put anything on it. Yeah, I mean, video games are a medium. That is not very questionable. Medium is not questionable. Genre is more questionable. And you can have any genre on any medium. Sometimes it might be harder to pull off, and I'm sure there's some weird intersections of examples. But, yeah, genre is not medium. Comics are not superheroes by default. Superheroes do not have to exist in comics. Clearly, they can exist in movies, poems, prose stories. I mean, you've all seen prose stories of, like, Spider-Man or Batman or the Green Hornet somewhere in your travels. I mean, like I said before, Doc Savage is not necessarily... But, I mean, he was a pulp character that informed Superman, and that was in books before comics. There you go. And then they published Doc Savage comics later. Boom! Whoopie-gee willikers. Then, interesting thought after watching a little more of CDC's Camp's video, he talks about how the Punisher, again, is not necessarily, in some people's eyes, a superhero because he evokes the same sort of tactics that the villain would use. Okay, there are certain things that, I mean, are serially written or seem like it, like, is Doctor Who a superhero? I think is actually an interesting question that rides the line in a more interesting way, because in a lot of ways he kind of has a costume, has superpowers, is all that, but isn't like, like a Marvel or DC thing, or like, just a crime fighter. I think that's more interesting. Obviously Doctor Who's more sci-fi than like superhero, but I find him more nebulous, and I wouldn't necessarily want to say yay or nay. But often, as an element of a Doctor Who episode, he will flip the script and use whatever the villain was using to throw it back in their face. And he is the hero at the end, vis-a-vis the Punisher doing the same thing, puts him on, in a way, the same playing field. Though, morally, he's willing to sink lower than, whereas Doctor Who always takes a moral high... most of the time takes a moral high ground over the villains. So, I don't know, just interesting elements that if you play it one way or another, people are going to see it one way because it aligns with a certain value set versus another. But if you look at it from a literary standpoint, they're more alike than you would necessarily think in a kind of base audience level. And then he asks a fucking third question. Okay. So he asks kind of a lot of what I covered. Like, do you feel you can define the genre, yada yada? Yes. But he kind of brings up the idea that, okay, so like, his friend says that, I know superhero, Superman, fucking superhero. Boom. Okay, yeah. But he says that the idea of a superhero genre would have to be more complicated, which is interesting because in that statement he almost says he's answered his own question, but whatever. So X-Men, he brings up, is more complicated. They deal with bigotry of all kinds and, flying out into space, and when your past self comes back to the present, dealing with the idea of being attracted to who would be your kind of frenemy, in a sexual way. Yeah, the Cyclops X-23 thing I can't get past. Anyways, so superhero, the genre, is it more complicated than Superman? Yes. That's doubly interesting for two reasons. First, the only reason Superman is interesting as a character is the antithesis of how you normally write to make a character interesting. Normally, if you have a more paragon virtuous, whatever character, you have to really slide and degrade their morals, and they will pull through or not, and that dilemma is interesting. And you don't honestly know. With Superman, the only way to make him interesting is to know that he's going to be virtuous, but the question is more how he's going to find the way to do the right thing, because he can do pretty much fucking anything. So the only interesting way is for him to have to find a creative solution to do the right thing. Superman is a weird character like that, which presents a weird problem month after month to create compelling stories with that paradox in mind. However, so when you're not dealing with god tier characters like Superman, they are still superheroes. And so they need to be more complex, but just because you are in a genre doesn't mean that any topic is off limits. Genres do kind of, like, when something fits within a genre, you've limited your options, but you've also fallen into your genre by will, presumably, when you're writing something, or it's some onset about the character that you're writing, however you come at that, pain versus pleasure. So you have a kind of lens to focus it through, but that lens can be focused to look at anything. Because, I mean, when you're saying, like, it's more complex than just good guys fighting bad guys, well, what defines the bad guy? Why is he bad? What is he doing? What's his motivation? What's the hero's motivation? What is it that they're fighting over? And when you're dealing with superheroes, I mean, the idea of moral ambiguity, crime, I mean, even just more specifically drugs or war or anything like that is totally fair game. And all those topics are what have informed most of literature. I mean, yeah, you're not necessarily going to do a superhero memoir, but there's totally been stories written like that. And so topics are not going to be defined by genre. So it can talk about anything, and that's where you're going to start getting the difference between a good whatever genre story versus a bad whatever genre story. And so there you go. And I want to asterisk literally everything I said, because what I'm talking about is really, honestly, very base level literary understanding, with my degree that says I understand these things. But all of this has always been up for debate. There's no scientific rule of literature. There's no mathematical proofs to make. Most of where these rules and definitions come from are the same way any social rules or definitions are held, within a certain common discourse and court of belief, which I guess the best way to put it, to give it a parallel, is like grammar. There are people who believe that there are set and fixed rules of grammar that will never change. Those people are wrong. The entire evolution of the English language has been breaking down to communicate more information more expediently, which means, yes, always knowing more vocabulary and understanding the rules and whatnot is going to allow you to do that better and more effectively. But there are certain rules within grammar that I'm sure you hear questioned all the time, and there are those grammar Nazis that will uphold them, and then most people don't give a fuck. And it's at a sliding scale where when it gets to be 90% of the people don't give a fuck and 10% are grammar teachers are going to have to change their tune, because they're the only ones holding on to it, and then we will fix a change. Same thing can be applied to any idea of a trope or a genre or a definition, but truth be told, those kind of hold a different area, because the way we understand superheroes at this point has so much history behind it that it can be informed and changed for sure, but the basis of it at this point, I believe, is pretty firmly rooted. And so it's not, it can steer and veer, but it's going to maintain more or less the same route. It can grow and go in different directions, but it's going to come back to the same place, I guess, to make a really weird metaphor out of nowhere. Beer is awesome. And so that goes for the genres and the tropes, but the tropes are much more varied to fall out of favor or memory and kind of change around, whereas the genre and kind of like genre-specific tropes tend to be more entrenched. So there you go. It's always changing, but for the most part, it's always going to stay the same. So that's my take on it. Yeah, if you have questions or comments, or you haven't hit that like button, you know where to go. And please check out Mr. CDC Camp's channel. I had to talk to them recently. I'll put a link to the video. His is only 3 minutes long, and look what that wrought. Look what that fucker did. So here we go. Boom. Have a good night. And this is just me off the cuff. If you have any pinches, points, or disagreements, or if I said something stupid, which is oh so very likely, just let me know. I've been proven wrong before. I'll be proven wrong again. Shit happens, man.